A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 32 through 44. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. This is Jesus and the disciples. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time, it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to them, "That would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. And he also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. The good news for us today, thanks be to God. Will you pray with me? Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your eyes, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In today's story from the Gospel of Mark, we start with a lot of hungry people. And I mean a lot. 5,000. And that's just counting the men, if you noticed. In another version of this story, in Matthew reminds us that the women and children weren't even included in that number. The disciples know that soon these people who have been content for the moment with Jesus' words and healings, well, they're not going to be satisfied for long. At this point in the evening, Jesus has been preaching for a long time. Think about it when the service goes really long and you're ready for that cookie, except for at the end of the day. Jesus has been preaching for a really long time, and all of these people, 5,000 men plus women and children, all of these people will soon be hungry, hangry probably. The disciples beg Jesus to send them away, to tell them to go and get food for themselves. It's the logical thing to do. But what does Jesus say? Does anybody remember? You feed them. Now put yourself in the disciples' shoes. If it were me, I imagine I'd be thinking, excuse me? We only have a few loaves and 2 fish. How are we going to feed all of them? But then they do it. And the meal is so plentiful that when everyone has eaten their fill, the disciples gather up 12 baskets of leftovers. This story shows up in all 4 Gospels, and it's one of the only miracles that does, and that tells us something. Now, for some, that serves as proof that this really happened, just like the story says. It's like witnesses giving testimony in a court of law. If 4 witnesses tell the same story and there are no other witnesses to contradict them, then it must be proof of the literal truth, right? Maybe. But I think that the repetition speaks to an even deeper truth. Not necessarily the truth of the historical details, but the truth of who Jesus is. I think that the repetition of this story in all four Gospels is a sign that this is one of the earliest stories that those early believers told and retold so consistently that when they were finally written down, it made it into all four Gospels that we have. And I think that they did that because this story gets to the heart of what Jesus was about. That somehow, when people come together because they know that a change must happen, and they offer even the little that they have, what emerges can be beyond their imagination. What emerges can be miraculous. I don't know about you, but listening to the news this week, I sure feel like we could use something miraculous. Another week of headlines about the war in Iran, another week of watching families flee, cities burning, leaders trading threats instead of compassion. And even outside of the war, closer to home, it feels like we've been living with an ache that just won't let up. From so much division, so much loss, so many cries of we don't have enough. I think we know what the disciples felt like. I at least see what's happening in the world and I think I don't even have the energy to watch the news anymore, let alone try to imagine what I could or should do. And when I do try to imagine, what I see is way beyond broken. And it does feel hopeless and downright frightening. A couple of weeks ago, Gus and I were driving in the car. I was driving, he was riding. And he asked me, kind of out of the blue, how much longer that bully was going to be president. That's how we've explained to him the problem currently. And the way that he measures time is how old will he be when something happens. And so we figured it out. We figured out that he would be 10 years old when someone else has the chance to be president. And next he was asking about global warming and climate change and some other of these big issues that somehow he hears about. And I found myself having a really hard time giving him honest and yet hopeful answers. No wonder most of us don't even have enough imagination to dream of something better. On her NPR program On Being, Krista Tippett has a name for this feeling. She calls it reasonable despair. She says that reasonable despair is not a failure of faith. It's a sign that we're paying attention. Because the gravity of what is happening can make despair seem like the only reasonable response. And yet, the story we heard today, this story that was so important to the early Jesus movement that it ended up in all four Gospels, this story suggests that even reasonable despair doesn't have to be the end. And it suggests that because this story of this miracle doesn't happen in a vacuum. Both Mark and Matthew place this story of the feeding of the 5,000 right after another story, the story of John the Baptist's death. Just before Jesus feeds these crowds, there's another feast that happens, a feast thrown by King Herod. At Herod's banquet, wealth, greed, and fear rule the table. Herod's niece dances, his ego swells, and at the end of the meal, John the Baptist's head is served up on a plate. So just after that horrible display of excess and capricious violence is when this huge crowd of people who have probably heard the news that another, even more famous follower among them, leader among them, John the Baptist, has been beheaded. This huge crowd of people come to Jesus, grieving the news of the beheading, hungry for better news, for good news. They've just seen what the feasts of the powerful produce. They've just seen what the broken systems and violent kingdoms of this world can offer. And that's when Jesus shows them what real abundance looks like. By setting the story of this miracle right after the story of John's brutal murder, Mark and Matthew set these two tables side by side: the palace banquet table of King Herod and the wilderness table of Jesus. Mark and Matthew set these tables side by side so that we can see the contrast clearly. Herod's table is one of fear, greed, and death, while Jesus' table is one of compassion, sharing, and life. It's almost as if Mark is saying, look, here, which kingdom do you want to live in? Because here's the thing. In Jesus' story, the abundance doesn't fall from the sky, and it's not delivered by paid servants. It comes from the people. It comes from those who were tired and grieving and hungry. Jesus doesn't perform this miracle alone. He looks at that frightened, despairing group of disciples and says, you're the ones to feed them. And then, when these frightened, despairing people start to share what they have, they discover that it is more than enough. This is what Krista Tippett calls muscular hope. It's not a soft or sentimental hope. It's not silver lining optimism. Muscular hope takes courage. It's the kind of hope that looks reasonable despair in the face and then refuses to hand it the mic. It's the hope that doesn't deny the very real despair of our time, but also doesn't accept it as the last word. That kind of hope takes practice. It takes community. It takes prophetic imagination, the willingness to dream something true in the middle of what feels impossible. The writer and activist Adrienne Marie Brown calls this the imagination battle. The world keeps telling us stories of scarcity and fear, but she says that we can tell better stories. Stories rooted in abundance, stories rooted in the stubborn belief that what is shared multiplies. Adrienne Marie Brown often draws from the wisdom of Octavia Butler, the groundbreaking Black science fiction writer who lived here in the Pacific Northwest. Butler imagined futures shaped by compassion and community instead of fear and domination. And her work is having a renaissance now, long past her time, because people are rediscovering how Butler's stories help us to imagine survival and transformation when old systems are falling apart. Octavia Butler once wrote, "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." If we wake up, so much is possible right now. That is where hope lives. In the waking up, in looking around and realizing that we are not alone and what we have together is already more than enough, hard as that might be to believe. Because that's the miracle of this story. Not that Jesus somehow made food appear from nowhere, but that when people stopped fixating on what they lacked and dared to dream based on what they had, divine abundance was revealed. Because they came together and trusted that God could meet them even in their despair, even in their grief, muscular hope and prophetic imagination started to take shape. And that's still the invitation for us today. To look reasonable despair in the face, to name it honestly, and then together to live as if God's abundance is real. To live as if we can really become what we hunger for. That's the good news. That's the Lenten truth, that together the impossible becomes possible. Remember what Octavia Butler wrote? There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. The impossible becomes possible when we refuse to be shut down by even reasonable despair, when we dream boldly, and when, by grace, we keep turning toward one another, showing the muscular hope, the prophetic imagination that God has planted in each and every one of us. May it be so. Amen.